We all know the Willys Jeep steering system is pretty adequate for 99% of your driving style, but for that 1%, sometimes it'd be nice to have something a little bit extra. For driving on the road, I have no problem with stock steering column. I've been off-roading with this thing for years. However, when you're off-road and you're spending a lot of time on rocks and tight areas, etc., this steering wheel can be just physically exhausting because it takes so much pressure to turn the wheels, especially if you have a locked front axle. To remedy this solution, I'm using electric power steering on my Willys Jeep. I did not come up with this idea myself. I gotta give all the credit to a guy on the CJ2A page for making a thread on how he converted his Jeep into electric power steering. Now, if you're not familiar with steering setups, here's what we got going on. This one right here, of course, the rusty one, is a factory style Willys Jeep steering column. All you have down here is a steering box. So you get your steering box and then a column that's 100% solid that goes up to your steering wheel. Now this one's had the spokes cut off of it, but imagine there's a steering wheel at the end of it. Not too complicated, right? Well, this is a modern car steering system, and this one came out of a 2009 to 2013 Toyota Prius. This thing, it looks pretty complicated, but in reality, not so much. We can actually take this little section right here and pull it away. So what we've got is an electric motor right on the center. This is electric power steering assist. So rather than a hydraulic setup for power steering like a lot of older cars use, a lot of the modern cars use an electric setup. There's no hydraulic hoses, no hydraulic reservoir tank, no hydraulic pump on the motor. I mean, you're saving a lot of hassle with an electric steering setup. Now, the problem people think is, well, if your electric steering goes out, what happens? This thing kind of goes into a limp mode where it's not electric assist anymore. It's more of a manual steering system. So if this thing fails, you're basically reverting back to that stock setup. No big worry at all. So this is where we need to adapt our steering wheel. This is the electric motor. This is the control box for the steering system. I know some of our alternators don't like more electrical load, but we're going to have it anyways. Now, the guy I bought this from on eBay, he actually pre-labeled all the wires for me, I believe, that I need. So we've got a battery negative right here. The blue wire is battery positive. Then this tiny blue wire is your keyed power. And these two wires that are twisted together, I don't believe I need those. But the rest of these connect directly into the motor themselves. And then after the motor, you've got your steering column. Now, the nice thing about a modern steering system is they're designed for safety. So let's say you get into a car crash with a stock steering column. That is a solid one piece. It shoves directly into your chest. Not a good situation. All modern steering columns have U-joints in them. And that is, in the incident of a crash, let's just say the front end gets hit, the steering column collapses, and it does not shove that into your chest. Is that a huge worry on the Willys Jeep? Not really, but it comes in handy, this style, because of how we're going to have to install it. So in simplicity, what we're going to do is cut the steering shaft off on the stock Willys box. We're going to weld the electric power steering column to that, and because this has U-joints on it, we're able to place this kind of wherever we want because it's still going to turn. And the neat thing is that this has an adjustable column on it. See how that column extends? So you don't have to have this thing absolutely perfect when you're welding in your Jeep because you got some room for play right here. Of course, we need to find a way to stuff that electric motor up underneath the dash and then to adapt the factory steering column and tube and steering wheel onto that electric motor part at the end of it. So that's going to be a little bit of a challenge, but I honestly don't think it's going to be too hard at all. This is a great opportunity for me to do this conversion because my steering box, as you can see, it doesn't sound happy. My bearing at the top of the column is all worn out, and my steering wheel is to the point where I can hardly turn my wheels. I know I got a welded front axle, but when I'm out on the trail, my arms actually get fatigued after about 7 minutes because my steering box is absolutely shot. And we're going to tear that apart here in a minute. So number one, my Jeep has been underwater too many times. Steering box probably got hurt from that. And then number two is that my steering box developed a pretty bad leak when I was out west, and it leaked out all the oil before I realized it. So I've been cranking on this wheel with the steering box absolutely dry, and it has quickly deteriorated into the thing hardly turns at all. So that's why I chose now to do my conversion. Step number one, before you tear anything apart, I personally marked my steering column right where it meets this bracket right here, because this is what we need to know how far the steering wheel sits up away from the dash. If you don't have a roll cage, you can probably take this opportunity to push your steering column a lot higher up into the dash to gain more belly room between the seat and the steering wheel. Removing the steering box on a Jeep's not a very fun task. I removed my driver's side fender, left the hood up, and now we can actually get to the steering box. Typically, if you want to get the steering box out in one piece, you need to disconnect the column from the rest of the Jeep. So you've got the two bolts under here on the dash. Then you do need to pop the steering wheel off. And this is not a fun task either. I've got my steering wheel nut right here. You got the little centerpiece for this horn button. So I popped that off, and now the problem is the steering wheel is on splines. So to pull the steering wheel off, you almost can't do it by hand. If you try using a mallet or a hammer, you're just going to bend the steering wheel. So you need to get a steering wheel puller to grab from the bottom of the base of the wheel here, and then push on the center section to drive it off. Now once the steering wheel's off, how are you going to get the column out of the Jeep? There's a few ways to do this. None of them are fun. You can jack up the front of the Jeep really high, so that way you can feed the entire steering column in the box out from underneath the Jeep and out onto the floor. The only problem you're going to run into is the exhaust manifold on the Jeep. You might have to disconnect this header right here to get the box out from underneath it, and there's just no good way to do it. When you go to disconnect the steering box, I would remove the drag link from the Jeep, which is this bar that connects from the steering up front all the way to the steering box itself. Pop that thing off, and then you've got a fighting chance to get that steering box out of there. I use the steering wheel puller with my Milwaukee Impact gun, and I think I've got it just about ready to come off here. Might need a little bit more. I've got it pretty much ready to come off. I'm going to do a little bit of light malleting, and there we go. Here are the causes of my steering box problems. I had water just absolutely pouring out of my steering box down in my bucket right here. I didn't catch the camera quite in time, but you can see by the grease moving down the frame, half of this is water. Absolutely not good at all, which is why I am swapping steering boxes instead of adding electric power steering to this steering box. We've got the EPS sitting on the workbench ready to get this thing figured out. And as I mentioned before, this little tilt column section right here, you might as well just take that off because we're not going to use that in the Jeep. It looks pretty complicated. It just doesn't fit the vintage look, so I'm not even going to use it. And I don't need any tilt steering anyways in my Jeep. Now mine's got this plastic piece right here that just loops around the column. Pull that off too. I saw some people had troubles getting theirs off. Mine actually fell off when I was carrying it across the room, so I got pretty lucky there. And obviously, I'm going to take that off, wasn't connected, and I'm going to hold this up under the Jeep just to see what we're working with. So we're probably looking about something right there, which is not the greatest. That's me hanging down a little far. I finally got the shaft out of the tilt steering column section, and it was not easy to do. There is a snap ring that sits on the end of the shaft, so that's the first step you need to do before working on getting this bearing removed in these pieces. On the shaft, when it's sitting inside, there's a bearing right about here, and this bearing's held in by little tabs that are bent over. So the easiest way I found to do is just take a grinder and grind all those tabs off. So there's 4 of them all the way around the diameter of this. Then what I had to do was matching the shaft is sitting inside of here. I hammered the bottom section of the shaft out part way, that way the bearing was exposed. I took this nut off. This little collar is just splined onto here. Popped that off, and then I was able to use a hammer to knock the bearing off of here. Then what I did was I put this back on, put the nut back on, and then I hammered the shaft out of the opposite end of this. I tried hammering it all the way out this way, but for some reason they've got this big collar right here, and it just doesn't want to go through this very easily. So I found a way easier to just knock the whole shaft out the other side. With that shaft freed from the little tilt steering section, now we could slide it in here and get to work. The biggest trouble I'm having right now is locating the electric motor underneath the dash. This is my tape line from where the bracket used to sit. Obviously, you see the witness marks from the little black felt piece. The most difficult task, I believe, in this whole setup is figuring out where to mount the box. Now, I know that the factory column mounted right about there. So that was even with the dash, which means I want this to be approximately right here on the electric setup. Now, I'm not saying that I'm going to use that exact bracket. We'll probably use something different, but I know that basically this much of the shaft is going to be hanging out. So with all that in mind, here is the factory shaft. Here are the witness marks from the old bracket. So if you line those up, you see we're actually coming out pretty short. Even if we slide this out, it'd have to be all the way out to even come close. What we're going to do instead is use this to make an adapter to the factory steering column. That way we've got the proper threads at the end of the shaft so we can put the original steering wheel back on. And then we're going to take this tube, cut it, and then put it over here. So I'm going to figure that out and then get back with you. My next step is to figure out exactly how long to cut the steering column shaft. That way it meets up to the electric steering box and then up to the steering column. So what I've done here is made a little mock-up bracket out of some pretty thick steel. Just made it flat and it bolted up to the original bracket holes. Now luckily the steering column on this electric box is thick enough that this thing is actually holding it up against the Jeep. I can wobble around a little bit, but it's holding it in there pretty tight, just about where I'm going to mount it anyways. So with that holding it up, I've got my steering column bolted to the electric box. You can see how the stubby end of the steering shaft on there with the U-joint. I do not have the long piece on there. Then the shaft goes down into the floor of the Jeep. And on the inside I've got my old steering box. As I mentioned before, this thing is pretty well toast from all the water that was sitting in it. So I'm using it as a mock-up for my electric steering conversion. Wires ratchet strapped out of the way for some room to work. So I'm able to use my junk steering box to do some preliminary column cutting to make sure I don't cut my good one too far. What I'm already noticing here is that the steering shaft itself would pretty much reach the steering box. I've got to pull it all the way down right now, and if I push it up all the way, that's where it about hits the floor. There's really not that much clearance at all. So I'm going to cut down my steering shaft and just keep playing with some measurements there. I've got my steering column on the weld bench here, and you can see, as I was talking about before, my tubing to go from the original electric power steering module to the stock Willys Jeep column. So again, the smaller piece right here is the original spline part that went on to the electric motor. This is a tube that I made that went over the OD of the spline part and then OD over the original column shaft. And as we can see, turns perfectly straight, should be ready to rock. There she is with the outer tube put on. Now you can change the length of this tubing based on where you want your steering column to sit. I've got mine where I want it. The biggest trick question is to know how much of the shaft you want sticking out of the column. Now, I measured a stock Jeep, and this was about 1.5 inches. And if you go any lower, the bottom of the steering wheel is actually going to start rubbing the shaft. So I went a little bit over 1.5 inches. And if you have any problems with your steering wheel rubbing, of course, you can always just sand a little bit on your steering column. No big deal at all. So here's a little bit what I'm talking about. I had the steering column machined to fit the bearing that fits in top of the steering column, and then obviously to slide over the electric motor with a tight fit. Luckily, the bearing area is much larger than the motor area, so I just flip my tube upside down. That way it's nice and sloppy on top of the motor area. So this would be the top of the steering column, this would be the motor. And for testing, that's good because I can slide it up and down as necessary. And I can see I've got room to slide it upwards. Therefore, I know that my steering wheel is not going to be rubbing the steering shaft. I've got plenty of clearance here, about an 1/8 inch, which is absolutely perfect. I'm just going to leave it at that. I got my tube all welded up, the power steering lightly mounted just to the top of the dash cowl, nothing crazy yet. I want to show you what I found. I've got these little spacer blocks right here that I can add or remove as necessary to change the overall height of the steering wheel position. One thing I noticed when I lean my seats backwards, my head also goes backwards, and thus my overall eye position is downwards. With the seats leaned back on the Jeep, I feel like I'm almost looking through the steering wheel rather than above it. So normally in a Jeep, when you're sitting inside, you're looking over the steering wheel. Basically the steering wheel on a CJ3A per se, the top of the wheel is lined up with the hood of the Jeep. Well, I'm looking about right here, so it's a little awkward. And the problem is that to push the steering wheel down out of your vision, you're putting it right into your gut down here. You cannot have optimal vision and gut room. Here's my solution. To the left, we've got the standard Willys Jeep steering wheel. This is 17 inches in diameter. And to the right, I've got a generic tractor steering wheel off a certain website I'll place here on the video. This is only 15 inches in diameter. This fits like an Allis-Chalmers B model tractor, etc., etc. This is a stock Willys steering column. Of course, we have splines that go all the way around the steering column. Now, if you look at the Allis-Chalmers steering wheel, this is a tapered hole in the center along with a keyway. So obviously none of this will work on the Willys Jeep because a keyway is probably as wide as about 5 splines. Just not going to work along with the tapered shaft. I mean, it's just not compatible. Now, why did I pick the steering wheel that does not even fit over the Willys shaft over the original steering wheel? A, smaller diameter, you can have the good visibility up top with the gut room on the bottom. B, if you look at these steering wheels, extremely common in design. I'll flip this over here for good perspective. They both have 3 spokes, have the ridges on the back side for your fingers. I mean, they're a pretty good spitting image of each other. The only problem is adapting them to the factory Jeep steering column. Now, there are a few ways to do this. I'm going to outline the possibilities that I figured out and what I ended up going with. Possibility A, because this is tapered with the keyway, when modifying the electric motor for the electric power steering conversion, you can buy an Allis-Chalmers steering shaft, just the top section, and weld it to your electric power steering. That's going to give you the necessary taper and keyway for mounting the Allis-Chalmers steering wheel. The only problem is you need to find a bushing that sits at the top of the steering column to hold everything in place. You don't want it wobbling around too much. Keep in mind when you have the Willys hub of the steering wheel, this is flush with threads. Obviously, once you put the nut on there, it's going to slide down, and that is what slides down the steering column to keep all the weather out. If you have this thing flush with the steering column, you'll notice you have a gap between the column and the wheel, and if you get weather and water and mud all the way down this column, it's going to go straight to the bearings of your power steering. You don't want that, so you need that little bit of protection to cover the steering column. And that extra little bit of protection, as shown on the bottom of the steering barrel right here, is what keeps the weather out of your bearings and your steering wheel. Now obviously the Allis-Chalmers does not have that. So what I opted to do, which is a great idea by Vintage Jeeper, who also sent me this part, and we'll get to that in a second. Because I was telling him, I was like, alright, I'm going to go buy this tractor steering column, weld it to my setup, then I can run the tractor steering wheel. And he's like, well, why don't you just cut the hub out of your original steering wheel and make it fit the tractor one? So that's exactly what we've done. This is the center hub section out of the stock Jeep steering wheel, which would have sat up here originally. Now, it was originally a lot thicker. This thing would have been this diameter all the way up, but what we've done is turned it down in the lathe to fit inside the hub of the Allis-Chalmers steering wheel, just like so. Now, we've got the better style steering wheel with the Jeep splines that slide onto your original steering column. And then of course we've got our overhang on the back for the column tube to keep all that rainwater out. To make this hub fit on nice and perfectly and be flush with the end of the steering wheel, we actually had to turn down the back side of the tractor steering wheel. If you look at the spoke, you got about a quarter inch in front here to the end of the hub, but right here it's very close to the edge. That's where we knocked it off just to make everything fit really nice. You can't go more on this end of the hub because you're going to run out of material, as you can see from the inside. This is the bushing that goes to the top of the stock steering column that then presses down into the stock steering tube. And this is a good bushing that keeps your steering wheel nice in place at the top of the column. That way you've got support all the way up here. If you ever see a Jeep and you grab the steering wheel, it's flopping all over the place, likely the bearings that were in the stock column are either shot or not there at all. Very, very typical that I've seen. I tried to cheat the system and buy the stock bearings for the steering column. I went to put them into my steering column, tapped a little bit, the thing shattered. The little ball bearings just went all over the floor. Absolute junk product. And I've seen these advertised online quite a bit. And yeah, they're a little pricey, but what you get is well worth the money. I think I spent a little over $75 on this little piece right here. But if you'll notice, it is a two-piece design. If you look at this thing, there's actually two different parts on it, the outer and the inner. So if you need a replacement part, all you need to do is pound out the inner section, buy a new one of those, and then push it in. You can keep your outer section. And I really like that there's a lip at the top of this that stops it from going too far down into the steering column. Overall, really, really nice part and absolutely necessary to have for the build. Like I said, I tried to use the stock steering column bearing and it just blew apart all over the floor. If those bearings blew across the floor that easy, what happens when you're off-road and you're yanking on the steering column really hard? Not good at all. So with this little setup right here and our majestic little adapter hub onto the tractor wheel here, we're looking at a really nice steering wheel setup. Now with this steering wheel, as I'm sitting in the Jeep, I've got plenty of room right here, and I am no longer looking through the steering wheel like the old green one, but rather above it, and I can see my hood line very, very well. All I need to do now is take this steering wheel, drill a couple holes through the side, that way I can tack weld all the way around, and then weld on this top section. That way my hub and this are all one nice piece. I just cleaned up my steering box with a wire brush. I'm going to hit it with some spray paint, put it in the Jeep, but I wanted to show you my first major concern with the swap. So if you look at the nature of the steering box in the Jeep, you know, obviously it would sit upright and you fill it up with oil. Now normally the steering box is never laid over on its side, so it never has an excuse to leak oil out of the top of this shaft section. Basically there's a bearing on the inside. Then depending how your steering box is, there are shims that accommodate for that bearing setup. So once this is all shimmed and put together, it bolts up like that. Easy peasy. Then you've got your stock steering tube that comes all the way down and clamps over it. So when it's in a Jeep in stock form, the steering tube is covered by the steering wheel, and it goes all the way down and covers this. So it keeps water from going down into this tube. Well, we're not going to have that anymore because we've got our electric steering, and we're going to end up cutting the shaft off and getting a U-joint on here. So there's nothing to protect the steering box from water running down the tube. I need to figure out what I'm going to do, but I can see this being a long-term problem. I suppose what we could do is find the OD of this and then the ID of this inner piece and maybe find an oil seal that fits in there, but it's so tight, there's really not much room for an oil seal at all. I spent the last few hours refreshing my steering box a little bit. I've got a brand new oil seal on the side where the pitman arm hangs off, and then on the inside, probably can't see it, but on the worm gear itself, I've got brand new ball bearings at the bottom and the top. And now I am setting my bearing preload, which is done with these little shims shaped like a Dorito. And I'm not going to go over how to rebuild a steering box because Metal Shaper's got some really good videos about it online. But essentially what you're doing is adding or removing shims underneath this cover. The one thing that really irks me about the stock steering box system is the way that they're designed. So essentially all you have are 2 pins on the sector shaft right here that stick out, and they ride on this worm gear. And that's a lot of stress on 2 small little pins. Probably not the best idea to be adding power steering to it, but nonetheless we're this far in. And the problem is that this worm gear piece, I haven't looked it up online, but I'm assuming that this worm gear is pressed into what would be the original steering shaft. And the problem is that if you look at every single one of these worm gears where they meet that shaft, every single one is bent and warped. I mean, we looked at the one earlier that was cracked and the whole thing was wobbling as you twisted the steering shaft. Well, this one looked really nice from the outside, and I can already tell with it sitting in the steering box. Look at that. Now we're not looking at my adapter piece itself, we're looking at the original worm gear shaft. It's got wobble side to side. Might not be super visible on camera. Just a little bit of bent down here is a lot up here, and that's the problem with these stock boxes, that every single worm gear is junk. You should probably just start off with an entire new worm gear anyways, because it's either going to have pitting or they're going to be chipped. I mean, there's probably not really a good original part out there. I went through 4 different used steering boxes to try to figure out which of the best of the worst parts that I could use, and this is the one that I came up with. Honestly, if you're going through all the work of keeping the stock steering box, by the time you buy a whole new steering shaft just to get that little worm gear, you buy the full rebuild kit, you worry about wire brushing or sandblasting this, repainting it, you'd be better off just buying a brand new steering box, cutting the top of it off, and then just going about your day. It's not even worth messing with trying to save all this stuff, unless you're trying to keep your Jeep original, but if you're adding power steering, I'm assuming you are not. So that is just my 2 cents to you, is just go get a new steering box. This is what we've got for the top piece. CR Seals part number 8624. Now it fits the diameter of the steering shaft really nice, but the problem is that it's hard to get an oil seal with that big of an ID and a small OD to match. Realistically, if you were to find the perfect oil seal, there'd probably be no thickness to the thing and it would just crumple apart. You need enough room for that little spring on the inside. So as you can see right here, it is not a good fit at all. It's hanging out the side, so what we had to do is simply turn down the ID of this piece, which we did on this one right here. We got the oil seal to be a nice little press fit. It's going to work out perfect, and you can see how much meat was taken off the sides of this thing. And what we found out is that these things actually aren't really built that straight, so mine's got a lot more thickness here and a little less over here. Just something you're dealing with old original used parts. My only concern with this setup is that because these shafts wobble quite a bit using old used parts, is that it might wobble and start to eat that oil seal, and once this thing starts to get eaten, you know, water finds its way down there, mud, etc. So that's just one potential issue to keep in the back of your head. The box is finally fully assembled, ready to rock. The last thing we need to do is add a bolt for my little adapter piece. I've got it welded right here at the top, but the problem is my steering shaft link is already so long that I can't afford to lose any more room. So what I did was, rather than extending the weld upwards, I've drilled a hole through both my adapter piece and the original worm gear shaft, and we're going to throw a bolt inside of there. Ideally, you'd want to use what they call a shoulder bolt, so this thing is really nice and smooth all the way across. If you have something like this with threads, as you're turning that shaft back and forth, the threads will start to sawzall the thing and just make it super loose. Now, I don't have the proper size shoulder bolt here, but I do have is a really long bolt that might as well be a shoulder bolt right here. So we're going to put this in the steering shaft with Permatex on it, but I'm just showing you what we got going on. You can see the shoulder of the bolt just barely sticking out, so we're going to fix that by adding another washer. We'll add ourselves a nut on the end and then cut the rest off and paint it. And there we have it. Now I just realized, staring at this thing, I forgot to weld the top of this shut, which I need to go do right now because we don't want water to go straight down through there. There she is, finally ready to go in the Jeep. Everything is done, welded, cut, replaced, painted. There's nothing else I can think about doing on this thing. Even got the wiring loom on there ready to rock. I'm going to show you why I had to add extra support to the backside of my electric motor that went straight to the firewall. If you grab the top of the column right here, I can actually bend the whole dash kind of back and forth a little bit. You can hear it clicking there. I was worried without extra support, after a long time of this thing bopping up and down, grabbing a hold of the wheel, that maybe all these spot welds would start to buckle on the cowl right here and start popping off the dash, which is why we actually added that support bar. There she is, runs from the motor right there and then goes all the way to the firewall. I'm going to bolt that on and then it should be nice and tight. There's our steering wheel all set up and installed in the Jeep. Not a fun job by any means, especially when trying to put the two bolts right here facing upwards. About impossible. Get your hand on the other side of the dash to put the nut on. But as I'm hooking all this stuff up and getting the Jeep put back together, first time I've even started in a couple months really, because the steering stuff, I mean the lead times were ridiculous. I've got the steering box all installed. All the wires kind of zip tied out of the clutch pedal area for now is good enough. But what occurred to me is that we have not even tried to test the electric steering motor. So what I'm going to do before I even bother trying to get that thing shoved up underneath the dash, because I don't think it's waterproof enough to leave anywhere else like the engine bay, I've got the one blue wire hooked up to keyed power on my fuse panel of the Jeep. With a key switch I can turn the power steering on and off. And then we're going to hook one of these up to a negative and one of these on a positive to a battery jumper pack to see if it'll work. The moment of truth, we've got the jumper pack hooked up and we got the key switch off. Wheel is just like normal to steer, no power steering at all. We'll turn on the test switch and see what we've got. Oh, check that out. One finger. Wow. Holy smokes. Never in my life have I been able to do that on a Willys Jeep. With manual steering, you always want to keep your hands on the outer edge of the steering wheel. You never want to wrap your fingers all the way around, because if you hit something like a log or a rock and it catches the wheel and it flings the steering wheel around, you can easily break a thumb on one of these, and I've almost had it happen to me. Try doing an artificial bump steer to see how the steering system reacts. With that being said, there's a couple different things I would change for a future install. Number one, when looking for an EPS unit, I would find one where the steering shaft, the end joints on them, are not cast iron, but rather just a mild steel. That way you can just find a tube that goes from the steering box to that shaft and weld it, put bolts through it, have no problems at all. When it's cast, you can't weld to it. Therefore, you're left with coming up with different creative ideas, and it just really extends the total build time to do this conversion. You can do some research online, the reasons why the factory Willys steering box really isn't that strong and good of a design. Yes, it works great for what it was intended for, but to put power steering through it adds a lot of stress on components that weren't necessarily designed to have that much stress on them. So for light trail riding and street driving, I would say you're totally fine with this setup. I mean, yeah, you might wear out components a little bit faster, but really it's no big deal. For extreme rock crawling, if you get your wheels into a significant bind, I don't know if I'd want to be cranking on the steering wheel with the stock steering box. You know, if the wheels are really in a bind, like vehicles with true power steering, you can turn the wheel and almost move the entire vehicle if those front wheels are in good enough bind. I would not try that with the stock steering box. Instead, of what I'd probably do is keep the EPS unit going to the dash, but past it you have two different options. If you don't have a winch on the front, or you don't care if your winch is offset, you can get a Saginaw steering box that sits right up on the front bumper here. I personally don't like the way they look, and I don't want to ruin the symmetry of my front end. So what you can buy is a Ford steering box. Yes, I know I got a ratchet strap holding my radiator on. I'm not going to make mounts for this thing until I'm 100% sure this has enough cooling capacity for my engine. Moving on, you can go with a Ford Ranger steering box that mounts right behind the radiator but in front of the engine, so it's definitely in a tight spot down there. So what you would have to do is run your steering shaft over around the muffler and then back to the box. So you probably have to have a couple carrier bearings to get it around the 4-cylinder, but it's easily doable, and that way you'd have a really heavy duty truck style steering box that you could, you know, use for in a lot more extreme situations than the factory box. Then of course, once you go to a Ford box, you're gonna have to change your steering linkages a little bit. Rather than having this two-piece design, there's one that goes all the way across to connect the wheels together, and then a separate one on top that connects to the pitman arm on the Ford steering box. I personally went so far down the rabbit hole this one, I'm just gonna run it as it is for a while. I've already purchased a Ford steering box. I'll probably upgrade mine in the future, but I'm gonna wait to see what I do with radiators because that changes placement. And you know what, the Jeep's running, so I'm gonna leave it alone right now. Just a quick note, my front axle is actually a Dana 27. These things are basically the same thing, 25 to 27. Yeah, there are a lot of internals, but as far as strengths go, pretty similar. The one thing to really look out for are the knuckles on them. You'll see this knuckle has these reinforcement gussets on the side. That is really handy to have with power steering because you're putting a lot of pressure on this little part right here. And with those gussets, it's just a lot more strength. A lot of people that go to power steering have those style knuckles. This is the finalized steering wheel nut. You can see that I blocked the end of it with a washer, some welding, some grinding. Turned out pretty good, and it just keeps all the water from going down into the electronic system. Flashing forward, I'm going to do a long-term review of the electric power steering conversion on my Jeep. This is about 3 or 4 months later after the initial installation of this setup. And I went out to Easter Jeep Safari Week out in Moab, Utah, and I wheeled the Jeep pretty hardcore for about 4 days. I purposely went with the groups that picked the harder trails just because I want to feel how the overall Jeep was going to perform, and that's why I drove out there in the first place. Easy trails, I can do that around here. So what I found is that the electric power steering was a lifesaver out there. You know, you could just maneuver the Jeep. I have a welded front axle, so my steering radius is really limited compared to a stock Jeep. So I had to do a lot of maneuvers, Austin Power style, trying to back and forth, get my Jeep set up on the rocks. And the electric steering made that really nice for me. The only thing I don't like is if you get the wheels into a bind, and I mentioned this during the install, you really can't fight the steering wheel. If you got the wheels up against a couple big rocks, you can pull as hard as you can on the steering wheel. It's not going to move, just like the factory setup. Don't even bother trying. But again, with the small steering box that we're working with and the amount of load that we're putting on, you don't want to do that anyways. As you can see, I've got my 2 mounts that go to the dashboard right here, and then I've got that third mount that goes straight towards my firewall. What I found out is that as you're flexing the Jeep on rocks, stuff like that, even on big hills, the Jeeps flex so much that this section of the dash is almost at a different point than this section. and the whole dash creaks and moves, and I kept hearing a popping sound as we were going over some gnarly terrain. And what I found is that there's a lot of stress on this bracket of the steering system. It's going to be very hard to see, if not impossible, but I actually believe it's starting to crack the welds on my mount on the dash setup. So what I'm going to do is probably cut these blocks in half and add a rubber mount to the dash, or I will remove this whole system and shorten the bracket that goes from here to the firewall, shorten that just a little bit, and then do the rubber on the inside where it looks a little bit cleaner. That way it's got some flexibility like a motor mount, and I think it's going to take a lot of stress off the system. So overall, I would basically treat the EPS conversion like installing a small block Chevy to your stock T90 transmission. It'll last as long as you want it to. If you try jerking around the steering wheel and doing crazy things, I could easily see you breaking something. But I went in some pretty good terrain and I pushed it a few times, but I was always aware in my head of what I was working with and just very conscious of how I drove the Jeep. And really, you don't even think about it. After you get into a groove, it's not like your purpose is thinking, okay, I can't turn the steering wheel this far because I might break something. It just all becomes very natural. And I will note that my Jeep was rotted out where the steering box mounts, so I added a pretty thick plate on either side, and it's way stronger than from the factory. But if you have a weak frame, you're going to start pulling that steering box right off of it. I would actually go a step further, and I would drill out the holes where your bolts go, and I would weld in a solid piece of tubing. That way when you tighten the bolts of the steering box, it's not crushing the frame. You've got a good strong pull on there, because with the hollow frames in these Jeeps, if you just try to tighten that bolt and you got a weak frame, it could try pulling the frame inwards a little bit, or you might even end up cracking the cast iron on the steering box. Just something to be on the lookout for. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys appreciated all the documentation that went into doing this conversion on my Jeep, especially flying a little bit solo here with not a lot of information out there. But I think it's a really great upgrade for these Jeeps. And if you're street driving your Jeep, this is going to be more than enough for your needs. The only time I'd really recommend going something a little bit crazier is if you're doing engine conversions and big, off-road trips, stuff like that.